Welcome to the Lending Brief podcast, brought to you by the GovNavigators and sponsored by Allocore. Allocore brings the precision and expertise of commercial banking technology to the public sector. From preventing fraud in small business loans to reimagining how Treasury processes payments, our guests share firsthand stories of innovation, challenge, and impact. Whether you're in government, financial services, or technology, this series reveals how modern lending platforms can better serve the public and protect taxpayer dollars. Welcome to the Lending Brief. Adam, it's Founding Fathers Day here at the Lending Brief.
Does that mean we get to go to that restaurant?
No,
That's Founding Farmers.
that's right.
That's a different podcast.
Get it straight.
Okay.
We're here with Allocore founder, Ben Wallace. Ben, we're so delighted to have you and grateful for your sponsorship of this podcast.
Glad to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
So let's start with how you came to be the founder of Allocore and tell us what it's all about.
Happy to. Yeah, the founding story of Allocore is actually with a group of really good folks that grew up years ago at JP Morgan. So we were all commercial bankers, finding our way through the software division of JP Morgan, a la early 20s. Just when the dot-com hit, JP Morgan was building a bank called Wingspan. So they were first kind of launching the internet bank. So that's how we all cut our teeth building software and operationalizing large systems for credit cards and eventually commercial banking at Chase. It's a heck of a way to learn commercial banking at scale. Of course, Chase bought Bank One and continued to scale. Jamie Dimon came in and the rest is history. And then we after having that and worked there for over 15 years, we actually, a group of us left JP Morgan with the idea to help turn around a regional bank in Pennsylvania right after the great financial crisis, just around 2009, 2010. And that sort of opened our eyes at JP Morgan. Naturally, as you guys probably know, you don't really think about community and regional banks or other lenders. You think about Amex and Citi, and that's really it. Your world of competition is relatively small. But that opened our eyes that, hey, there's 4,000 banks in this country. There's 11,000 credit unions. They all use very antiquated old systems. And could there be an opportunity? And that was really the rise of what was Summit and ultimately rebranded to Allocore years ago. Could we take some of that discipline and scale that we learned at JP Morgan building systems and then roll that out to the community and regional banking infrastructure, which was really the core of sort of the Allocore story. And that's what we began in 2017, 2018, when we all got together in this software company, then called Summit and now called Allocore.
So Ben, you started that with like you said, with those community and regional banks. Let's talk about the move into the government space and the federal government space. You all started out supporting folks at SBA. Talk about how you got involved at SBA and some of the things that you helped that organization achieve.
Yeah, the really interesting, or I think still fascinating, is the folks that are playing in this space, which are writing software, but know the domain of lending and credit really well. It's actually a very small community, certainly in the commercial world, and frankly, probably smaller in the federal world. So when we were building these systems, rolling it out to commercial banks and credit unions in 2019 and 2020, and then of course we knew what happened in March and April. The United States shut down. The Treasury empowered SBA with the relief, which ultimately was named the PPP program, and now they needed to take a brand new lending and credit program and facilitate it across 4,000 banks and credit unions, which happens to be our target market. So we were sitting there saying, okay, how do we commercially help the SBA deliver, right, with our commercial hats on? And then we quickly realized, as you guys probably did, that, man, SBA really had this unique challenge because they were a relatively small agency before the pandemic, and now they had all this liquidity and lending authority. So how were they going to operationalize that, more than less engage all these banks and keep the government and the country running? So we, via some connections we had, we reached out and said, hey, to the SBA, could we help facilitate this? Because we had an idea about how we were going to do it in the commercial world. Could we take some of that same software that was developed here and use it to actually face all these banks? So deploy our software inside the SBA as a vehicle to help manage the PPP program in April and May of 2020. And that's ultimately what we did. There's obviously a lot of story around that, but essentially, I think SBA looked at the Allocore crew as really sharp bankers that runs program at scale that could operationalizing a federal credit program pretty quickly. And that's what, they didn't have time to develop a system over 18 months. They really needed something that we can operationalize in 90 days. So you had to use an existing commercial product. That's what we had built for those banks and credit unions in the commercial world. So it was taking that, delivering that, and then obviously customizing it to the fast moving program that was PPP. And if you guys recall, it just wasn't a static program. It was rolled out by Treasury and SBA, then it was changed and modified again. And our ability to take those interim final rules and quickly adapt the software, educate Bank of America and all the other 3,000 banks about how to do this was also kind of a superpower of ours because we could speak their language, right? What does it mean to operationalizing a brand new program at JP Morgan? So I think it's a really good story of sort of private-public partnership, commercialization of technology into the government. Like that's how I think we move so quickly. And, we're sort of seeing that now in the current administration around how do you operationalize some of the programs. But that's how we got started in public sector back in 2020. And then obviously, which we can talk about, the story just continued to sort of cascade around, could we continue to help, the SBA modernize some of those other systems?
Yeah, I'm imagining you're like the kids when they're first shown Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. One of the things we're trying to convey with the lending brief is the scale and scope of the government's credit programs, the varied missions they perform. Tell us how you transformed the borrower experience, some of the benefits of your platform, and how you think expanding that across the government's loan platform is going to benefit these other programs and the missions they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
In a short answer, of course.
But you're right. There's a lot of parallels as we got to know the public sector federal credit space. JP Morgan looks from the outside in as a really polished organization. But as you peel the onion of that bank that manages an incredible amount of borrowers, 80 million borrowers, right, from a credit portfolio, they still have a fairly antiquated systems, right? They've done a nice job of over time spending $15 billion a year on tech refresh. But there's a lot of parallels to these agencies like the USDA or an SBA, which really mission-driven folks. They have a very clear mission, but the systems, it's hard to make those changes, especially as you build more and more complexity. So we saw a lot of parallels. And also the story about how you incrementally modernize was also a story. So we started with the ability to say, hey, how do you solve some of the biggest friction points, which ends up, Robert, to your point, being the borrower experience. So we had our platform that we developed to modernize that. And because it was, again, built in 2018, 2019, very new technology, built on a modern platform, very configurable. So just like we would go to a Navy Federal, we could go to an SBA and say, listen, your borrower journey is a little bit different. Let us customize it. Let's make sure that we, there's federal attributes of programs that are different than a Navy Federal or JP Morgan. So let's make those changes in collaboration with the government. But some of those things that we're all used to, the consumer experiences that we've got very well trained because of, the mobile phones, those are very common, and we're able to pull those into the government. So then it just becomes about how do you execute in sort of priority order. And that's sort of how we've been working down, not just some of the SBA story, but some of these other agencies that we're engaged in, taking some of these commercial best practices, massaging them around things that are unique in federal credit, and then obviously pushing forward. And also doing so with sort of speed and agility that I think is a little bit unusual to the federal space before, this idea of, hey, let's lead with commercial because that allows you to accelerate these programs and you're not having to do 3-year builds, which, as you guys know, 3-year build now seems kind of interesting. Starting to build a system today, what does technology look like 36 or 48 months from now, given how fast things are changing, it doesn't make any sense. So
Right.
How can you start now, deliver something within 6 months and then just continue to incrementally improve? But that's sort of how we think about accelerating these federal programs, if that makes sense, Robert.
Yeah.
So moving into federal is a hard jump for anyone. I want to hear a little bit some of your reactions and experiences, maybe what surprised you about that work. The way you talk about it, it makes it seem very seamless. And I know based on working with you all that the work that you do, you're able to adapt quickly. But the federal government's not always like that. So talk a little about things that kind of surprised you or stood out in your work to get Allocore moving into the federal space.
Well, one thing that I was surprised in, but what amazed me at the work ethic and the mission sort of driven folks that are certainly was in SBA during the pandemic era and still today. These folks are there for a reason. They believe, and they work as hard, if not harder, than some of my JP Morgan colleagues that I grew up with, right? Because they're there expressly for that mission and helping the small business or the disaster survivor. So that's still every day that when we get up and we execute the software mission, they're right behind us, kind of pushing us, make it. So that I think was maybe not surprising, but really refreshing to know that we have in these lending programs, which are very important for all those reasons I just said, we have some really good leaders that are pushing to make them better. So I think that's the other piece. And then not surprisingly, taking these commercial products into the federal ecosystem, what we're oftentimes doing is taking them into systems that were built or cobbled together over a period of 20, 25 years, not because it's anyone's fault or it was deliberately put that way, because they just organically matured. You can imagine since the 80s to 90s today, they started with a computer system, maybe built in COBOL, and they're having then to put a veneer of a portal on top of it. And then from there, they're adding a program. And all of a sudden, now you have 7 programs because you need to get $1 out to a farmer. And maybe that all wasn't orchestrated looking back in the way you would have done it today. Well, of course not, right? So that, no harm, no foul. But then the question is, how do you from today move fast to fix it, given what's happening with, as you guys know, some of the technology modernization, the AI work, and that's kind of really where we are. So I think the surprises were that the talent and the mission driven is incredible inside the federal government, especially in these loan programs. And then, the fact that we have, and this was a little bit surprising, we've matured. So you have these 16, 18 programs in these federal credit programs, and it's really difficult to quickly, before this idea of commercial first, to fix that was a little surprising.
You also, supported a program that was almost famous for the amount of fraud it suffered. But you were able to stem a lot of that. How do you tell us about that? What you found, how you stopped it, what the prospects are for expanding that across the government?
Yeah, the story that I don't think is often written enough about is what SBA did, not only around deploying the capital to keep the American small business vibrant, but then as they made some decisions around how to deploy that capital rapidly, they ultimately made some decisions about the investment in the fraud systems that now underpin the agency and protect disaster survivors and disaster victims, which is tremendous. If you look at the fraud posture and the systems that they deploy today, that we help them manage, really, really first class. I would compare them all day to the work that JP Morgan is doing, although a little bit different scale and focus, right? There's equities in those programs that JP Morgan doesn't have, and JP Morgan's managing against the P&L around risk versus some of the other sort of federal balances of positions. But you're right, Robert, the work that the SBA has done, and then we see happening, the Treasury is leaning in now. You hear a lot of discussions around do not pay, and with the new administration, how to make those data sources have more veracity. So I think we're slowly starting to see these agencies that are leaning forward, that have these systems like we're talking about, that can engage not just with commercial databases and prevent fraud, that interact with do not pay seamlessly. Right, that's really the ticket to success. And then if we can get more of that in these other agencies, whether it's USDA, whether it's the new loan program of the Department of Defense, whether it's in education, right, just continuing to raise the bar, because the technology is getting better. So are the fraudsters and how they're trying to manipulate these programs. But I think we're seeing such good results with how much we're able to block and prevent while still balancing speed and certainty of these dollars going out, because that's always the trick. Just like when you swipe your credit card, Chase could eliminate fraud, but they would have a lot of unhappy customers because it's almost impossible. There is a balance. No one wants to talk about that in the federal programs, but that's also a reality. You need to make sure these homeowners that lost their home. So it's how do we make sure we have first class systems, and then we're leaning into them. And I give SBA a lot of credit because they've made those investments. They continue to make those investments, and they continue to think about how to stay one step ahead of these actors who are using all the same tools that now, we're working with around AI and manipulating identities, et cetera. So it's a never ending battle, but that come such a long way since 2020.
So Ben, you mentioned a few agencies, SBA first and foremost, because that's where you all started in government, USDA, and there's others. We've also talked with you and on this podcast about there's hundreds of federal lending programs, 140, 150 plus. When you're looking across the federal loan portfolio, what sort of areas do you feel like are the most ripe for the types of advances that you've helped the folks at SBA achieve? where do you think there's some biggest opportunity for impact across the full lending portfolio of the federal government?
Yeah, it's just the story, because we've had the privilege of being out to watch these borrowers. Like, we went out to the Palisades around the disaster program, around the California wildfires, and you get these victims that walk in. FEMA would have a tent, SBA would have a tent, and they walk in. And really their question is, because they've never had to interact with the government in this capacity. They don't know what programs the government have and how they should navigate. So they know FEMA generally, they know SBA, they know a little bit about the programs, but their biggest question naturally is, right, how do I interact with this federal apparatus? And it might not just be SBA. Okay, does USDA has a disaster program? So how do you navigate these programs? And as you said, Adam, there's oddly enough numerous ways to get help, both grants and loans. And it's difficult, especially in the time of disaster, for these folks to navigate and make sure they're actually engaging with the right agency, with the right program. And should that problem exist anymore is really one of the questions. And I think we view this as probably not. The technology's there, that certainly we should be able to rationalize the ecosystem of benefits, and then having an Adam Hughes come in and say, hey, this just happened to me. The government has some programs. How do I quickly make sure I know the first, second, and third thing I should do to maximize the benefit and make sure I can get the relief I'm entitled to or need? That should be table stakes, but that's still actually very difficult today because of the amount of these programs. And then you see these discussions around, hey, there's a manufacturing program here. I'm not entirely sure it's going to get any easier because the programs keep getting more numerous, but I think there is an opportunity for technology and some of the work that we're trying to do to rationalize it and potentially, help, if you think about that borrower, help that borrower to get the programs. That's how we think about it, because we've seen it play out in real life. And you're not going to solve the entire rationalization of the 100%. Some of these are very niche programs for certain sectors that aren't relevant maybe to the consumer, but a lot of them are. And I think we can do a better job as sort of the government's helping navigate those programs, if that helps.
Yeah, like coordinating across programs where people don't necessarily need to see where they have to go or do things. You're in the intake process. The government is kind of handling those details, and sort of like the Wizard of Oz, don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain, right? And you input your information, and then they could say, here's your options, and you can kind of, it gives you a menu of things you can choose from. That kind of cross agency coordination is pretty difficult, but I agree with you. That would drastically change the experience of the borrower or the person interacting with government.
Yeah, because you guys obviously saw the executive order where they're trying to encourage at least cross-agency fraud and data sharing facilitated by the Treasury. I think that's a step in the right direction, but that implies that these systems are operational so you can share data with Treasury. So I think they're getting there, and that's like the most obvious. Hey, I shouldn't have a FEMA fraudster participate in an SBA program and vice versa. Great. Right. But then you're right. Can you move it up a level to have sort of rationalization on benefits? And, so I think we'll get there. It's how fast and can we help sort of accelerate that is one of our missions, obviously.
Ben, we're so proud of our association with Allocore. You've become a leader in this space almost overnight, bringing the community together in roundtables. You've partnered with Virginia Tech to do a deep dive analysis of the credit landscape and trying to integrate data about those programs. What else? What's the future of Allocore? What can you tell us to look forward to?
Yeah, I think as you note, Robert, our future is number one, continue to execute and modernize these programs that we're already sort of privileged to support, right, from a software perspective. So that's, we're 100% focused on just day to day, because ultimately we still see there's areas to improve. And then second, is there an opportunity, as Adam and I were talking about, to help rationalize these programs and help effectively constituency navigate, especially, we're talking a lot about farmers now, how do they help and what programs are available to them? How do they navigate these different programs? So I think you see us continue to double down on software product modernization, sort of the innovation cycle. And then can we sort of begin to help evangelize some of these, potentially policy items to help, these agencies and frankly, some of the technology around coordination across government. That's an area that we'll lean into as well. And then finally, to the extent that we can continue to contribute around the fraud fraud spaces and improve that technology. You know, we're obviously, because you really can't accelerate lending unless you have some of those, you know, those safeguards. So that continues to be an area that we're leaning into, Robert. So I think that those spaces, product innovation, to the extent that we can drive fraud, and then if we can evangelize some of the advocacy policy items that we spoke about, I think would be a huge help, you know, in the next few years for the government.
Great. Well, I can't wait to see where it ends up. And thank you for being with us today.
Excellent. Thanks, Adam and Robert. Appreciate it. We'll talk soon.